Katie's mum and dad separated when she was just 4 years old. Her dad really didn't have anything to do with her from that point on. She grew up with no real father figure in her life. Understandably, her mum was just trying to survive while looking after Katie and her younger sister. Life as a single mum is tough at the best of times, and her mum seemed preoccupied with everything else. Katie struggled to get her attention. A past like this affected Katie, particularly in those formative years. The voices of the past, painful memories, the emptiness, the hurt, all led Katie to have this huge hunger to be loved and to be accepted. And so when guys began to show her attention, she went along with it. She hadn't really experienced that kind of approval and attention before. It felt really good at the moment. It led to the series of random one-night stands. Each successive guy was a promise of experiencing love, finding some kind of approval. But years after this had been going on, Katie's heart was even more broken than before. Let me tell you the story of another person. Let's call him Mike. Mike is married to Melissa and has 2 young kids, a boy and a girl. Melissa was a real catch for him. She loves him, she looks out for him, she defends him. After all, Mike isn't, really much of a good looker. He's also what people would call socially awkward. Throughout his school years, he was the class geek, incredibly bright, but not good with people. Most people thought that he didn't actually like people or really care about what people thought. They were wrong. Mike had this deep craving for approval. In fact, the reason he threw himself into his studies and later his work was because he wanted to make a name for himself. And what was evident back in those uni days and what was more evident as he began work just kind of grew and grew. More research, more conferences, more trips away, late nights and weekends at the offices. He had this increasing drive to succeed. Perhaps when he became successful, whatever that meant, people would finally accept him. The problem, of course, was that there were cracks appearing in his marriage and in his family. It was just a matter of time before something just caved in. The irony, of course, was that those close to him, he was about to lose. Losing his wife and losing his kids, who actually loved him for who he was, not what he was trying to achieve. My guess is that in a room this size, there are people with scars, with a whole lot of hurts from past rejections, much like Katie and much like Mike. Perhaps you had a mum who was angry, a dad who was distant, parents who never accepted you for whatever reason. And you still hear the voices from your past. You'll never amount to anything. We never wanted you anyway. Or perhaps at school you were bullied from so-called friends who rejected you for another group. And this just went on for year after year as you weren't in the in-group. And the voices and the comments from the past still affect you today. And that drive, that kind of hunger you have, kind of sends you with this drive for approval to do these silly, rash things that actually hurt others, not to mention the scarring it brings to your own life. And that idea comes through in our biblical story today and relates to all of us. The idea is this. This drive for approval can drive people to act in ways that will forever hurt them. After a couple of weeks, break with kind of Rashan, we're coming back to this Breaking the Patterns series in the book of Judges today and next week. And we reflect, on patterns that need breaking in society, but also patterns that need breaking in our own lives. And we find help, I think, in these ancient words that we find in this First Testament from the time of Judges. The story begins this way. Again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. Again. It's like the writer's taking this deep, disappointed breath again. If you followed the series, you find that this is the 6th time this particular phrase has come up in the book of Judges. For the 6th time, the people of God have turned their back on the God of the Bible. When will they learn? Once again, they have turned to the gods of the surrounding cultures around them, and they've adopted this lifestyle that went with idolatry. Everything from the so-called sexual freedom right through to the sacrifice of children. It's a pattern that needs breaking. In fact, the text talks about 7 groups of foreign deities that they embraced. It says they embraced the images, or they served the images of Baal and Ashtoreth and the gods of Aram and Sidon and Moab and Ammon and Philistia. They abandoned the Lord, no longer served him. Sort of covering all their options, aren't they? The number 7 in Bible often kind of portrays something complete. I guess the idea here is that these people are completely nuts about what they're doing. They have abandoned the Lord who rescued them from slavery, who's placed them in the land of promise, who shows up again and again and again, but each time they have gone their own way. Of course, that would never happen in our lives at all, would it? Once again, we see the cycle in Judges. Once again, God hears the cry of his people as they cry out to him in the midst of their despair. Once again, God hears their cry and comes to their aid and sends a judge to deliver them. When the writer talks about a judge, he's not talking about a black-robed jurist who sits behind a desk hearing cases. A judge here in this book of Judges were these kind of political and even more importantly, kind of military leaders who would God raised up to deliver the people and bring them peace. The name of this leader judge was Jephthah. And though I doubt many of us know his name, Jephthah, we would be very familiar with the story as it's played out in our own lives, in this drive that we have for approval that drives us to do these crazy things that will forever hurt us. You see, Jephthah was a leader with a very difficult past. The headline for his story begins in verse 1 of chapter 11. Now, Jephthah of Gilead was a great warrior. It sounds good, but then it goes on. He was the son of Gilead, but his mother was a prostitute. Not a great place to start in life. You see, God raises up all kinds of leaders. He doesn't manufacture any of those leaders like Apple produces kind of their iPhones, just mass production of all these different phones, everything kind of the same color and might have a few different things. But, God raises up leaders very differently. It's like Michelangelo's statue of David carved out of the slab of marble, each one fashioned by his own context and background and time. Jephthah was fashioned in a very difficult home situation. Gilead's wife, we read, also had several sons. And when these half-brothers grew up, they chased Jephthah off the land. You will not get any of our father's inheritance, they said, for you are the son of a prostitute. By anyone's standards, Jephthah had a family that was very dysfunctional. His father was a man by the name of Gilead, evidently a leader. Gilead had this one-night stand with a prostitute. She got pregnant. Gilead let the prostitute hang around until the baby was born, and then he sent her packing. Not a great thing to do. And you don't have to be a counselor as you read this story to feel the tension in the family. Gilead's wife must have looked at that baby as a result of her husband's infidelity. His half-brothers despised him. He'd go out to play on the streets, and they'd yell at him, Get out of here. We don't want to play with you. We don't need you. You're not really one of us. You don't belong here. Childhood can be cruel at the best of times. When you're unwanted, when you're rejected, it just gets really tough. Jephthah knew nothing about unconditional love. So when he was old enough, he did what lots of people in this situation do. He tried to run away, as far away from his past as he possibly could. We read in verse 3. Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Soon he had a band of worthless rebels following him. Now Tob, at places mentioned, is quite a hike from where he grew up. It shows that he really wants to get as far away from his past as possible. In fact, there's irony in the name Tob as well, because Tob means happy. Because this is what Jephthah is searching after. He just wants to be happy. He wants to escape his past. He wants a place where he can belong. It doesn't have to have all these voices of the past calling out to him. Text here says that a band of worthless rebels followed him. In other words, he became a gang leader. Tob's underbelly embraced him. And he performs really well for this particular group as a skilled warrior. Everybody begins to hear about Jephthah and his gang, even the folks way back at home at Gilead. And while all this is going on, a surrounding nation by the name of Ammon has begun a war with Israel. And the people back in the hometown know that they're about to, have to begin a war with the Ammonites. And they're looking for someone to lead them. So they kind of gather their kind of leaders together. They have this brainstorm mode. They start to write names on the whiteboard about potential kind of military leaders that could kind of step in. And the name that keeps coming up is this name, Jephthah. And now they're looking at the boy they rejected and despised. And now they're looking at him as a potential champion. So the National Search Committee comes together and they say, well, actually, let's go to Tob. Let's say to him, let bygones be bygones. Sorry about what happened in the past, but let's kind of join together. We'd like you to be our leader. It must have been a delicious moment for Jephthah. Undoubtedly, some of the men on this search committee were the kids that bullied him. And here they are, sheepishly pleading with him to lead them. But Jephthah hasn't forgotten his past. He says here in verse 7, aren't you the ones who hated me and drove me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble? Of course, they assure him that things have changed. They want to move on. So after, their plea, to him, he says to them, all right, I'll come. But I don't want to just fight the battle and then find that you're going to reject me again, because I know what that feels like. If I'm going to do this, I want to be leader for life. So they reply, okay, well, this is a lifetime appointment. Jephthah agrees to lead them because this is his chance to finally prove himself and to be approved for his entire life. Now, at this point, you might think that because Jephthah was a gang leader, he wasn't a God-fearing man. But the text shows him to be a man pursuing God and his ways. Make no mistake, as tough and rough as he was, Jephthah was a man who took God seriously. One of the ways we see that is in the way he approaches the king of the Ammonites. He uses diplomacy. Rather than kind of just jump in and fight, he sends this letter, this long letter, you can read it later, it's like half of chapter 11, arguing why the Ammonites should just return the land back to Israel where it rightly belongs. Of course, if you're a king and you have an army and you have power, you don't tend to take diplomacy all that seriously, and here's the king of Ammonite marches to war. And so Jephthah, in response, also has to go to battle. And the text says in verse 29, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. And interestingly, that phrase is only used of 2 or 3 other judges in the book of Judges. Here is Jephthah, one of these kind of key leaders like Othniel and Ehud, who have seized their moment to step out. What a great leader. So Jephthah led his army against the Ammonites, and the Lord gave him victory. He crushed the Ammonites, devastating about 20 towns. And this way, Israel defeated the Ammonites. So here's Jephthah, great leader. He's broken the pattern for his people. He's chosen his fight. He's brought help. And the remarkable faith he shows leads him to be included in the Hall of Faith over in Hebrews chapter 11 of the New Testament. It's where often many of the great leaders and their accomplishments are found. And once again, as we read this story, we get to the stage and we're reminded of the way God raises up the most unlikely of leaders to fulfill his purposes. And maybe there's something, if you're here today and you look in the mirror and you look at yourself and you go, I could never be used by God. This is kind of one of those stories again, reminding you that God can use everybody and anybody. He used Ehud, a lefty. He uses Jephthah, a guy rejected from his youth. God is able to use each one of us in this mission of renewing people and places. Now, it would be nice if the story kind of finished here, but this story doesn't have a happy ending. And if you've been around in this kind of Breaking the Pattern series so far, you've probably got used to this particular cycle that comes through in the book. The same pattern occurs every single one of these stories. The people rebel, then God hands them over to the enemies. The people cry out to God for help. God sends a deliverer. The deliverer brings total victory. And then the story kind of finishes with, there was peace in the land. There's no phrase in the story about there was peace in the land. Even though Jephthah fought the fight and won, and the people experienced peace, there's no peace for Jephthah, because the story for him ends in this personal tragedy. While Jephthah brought peace to the city, chaos was about to rain down on his home. While he won in the city, he was about to lose in his own home. And the reason for this loss relates to this insane desire that he had for approval. That same insane, insidious drive that's in so many of us. So when we read this in our day and time, we can tend to think of, where am I? Just kind of got a bit lost. So Jephthah loses at home. And we kind of come back to this big idea that Jephthah's drive for approval was about to drive him to act in a way that would forever hurt him. I skipped over a couple of verses earlier, right between where the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Jephthah and he experiences total victory, and something else that happens. And this is kind of the turning point in the story. Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, we read. He said, if you give me victory over the Ammonites, I will give to the Lord whatever comes out of my house to meet me when I return in triumph. I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. So just before he goes to battle, Jephthah pleads to God, and he says, God, I want to be sure that you're with me. I swear to you that when I come back, whatever comes out of my house, I'm going to offer it as a burnt sacrifice to you to thank you for the victory that belongs to you. Now, when we read this in our own day and culture, we might think that he has in mind sacrificing a pet, a cat or a dog, because that might be the first thing that comes out of your house when you get home at night. But the people of Israel didn't keep animals in their houses. They didn't really have pets. And even if they did, it would be a bit odd to say, I'm going to sacrifice my dog or my cat to you, God, for the great victory that you're about to bring me. That doesn't really add up in the story. I think what Jephthah is promising to give God here is actually a human sacrifice. It doesn't make it any better, but probably in his mind, he's thinking about one of the slaves or one of the servants he would have in his household. He has this insane idea that he needs to impress God by offering a human sacrifice. And I think the reason he does this is because he grew up in a society that tolerated idolatry. And part of that idolatry was the worship of God through human sacrifice. And even though he loves God, even though he worshiped the God of the Bible, he's somehow taken on board the ideas of the pagan culture around him. A couple of years ago, I visited the exhibition down in Te Papa in Wellington, reflecting on the Aztecs. It was a certain group of people in central Mexico over in the 15th to 16th century AD, so not a long time ago, really. And these Aztecs were renowned for their sophisticated culture at the time. But they had this horrid idea that they could be won over by, or they could win over the gods around them through offering human sacrifice. This is what the surrounding nations of the time are doing as well. And Jephthah has just kind of bought into that because this idea, this insidious desire for approval is in Jephthah, and he wants so much to win the people's approval that he turns to God and feels like he has to entice God to get God's approval so God will bring him a victory so he can enjoy approval for the rest of his life. And he thinks human sacrifice will get it. The drive for approval drives him to make this foolish and unnecessary vow, and that act, that decision is about to forever hurt him. We come to the gut-wrenching part of the story. When Jephthah returned home to Mizpah, his daughter came out to meet him, playing on a tambourine and dancing for joy. She was his one and only child. He had no other sons or daughters. The text wants us to kind of grapple with this. Literally, it reads, look, his daughter was coming out to meet him. It's gut-wrenching. And then to hide in the pain, the narrator adds, this daughter was Jephthah's only child, his one and only that he is about to lose. His only daughter, his darling daughter, comes out to meet him, and coming out with laughter and joy and innocence and dancing and a tambourine and jubilance. And she comes to her father and wraps her arms around him, kisses his salty tears that are coming down his cheeks, and soon realizes that her father is not crying with joy, but with deep sorrow. Her dad explains, "Oh, my daughter, you have completely destroyed me. You brought disaster on me, for I made a vow to the Lord, and I cannot take it back." She said, "Father, if you made a vow to the Lord, you must do to me whatever you have vowed. for the Lord has given you a great victory over your enemies, the Ammonites. Dad, if you're sworn to God, you've got to keep your vow. You're going to have to offer me as that burnt offering. Let me just have a couple of months with my friends, and then I'll be back, and you can follow through with what you've promised. During those 2 months, she wept and she mourns, not only about her upcoming death, but also because she will never marry. She'll never have children. Jephthah's lineage will not be able to continue, something that for a Hebrew woman was almost as bad as death. She returned, and the text tells us in the last verses of chapter 12, when she returned home, her father kept the vow he had made, and she died a virgin. And it has become a custom in Israel for young Israelite women to go away for 4 days each year to lament the fate of Jephthah's daughter. Horrid story. And the awful thing about this vow is that he didn't have to make it, and he didn't have to follow through with it. If he had just known the scriptures, if he just paid attention to the scriptures, like from books like Leviticus or Deuteronomy, he would know that God forbade human sacrifice. God abhors it in the same way that any of us would abhor it today. But before we criticize Jephthah about what he does, I think we can kind of understand the way he just kind of got pulled into this surrounding culture that was around him. See, how much did he really know about God growing up the way that he did? How much would you expect him to know about God living in Tob? Besides, I think we have a lot in common with Jephthah. It's a insidious drive that we have for approval. It expresses itself in my life way too many times. And I'm pretty sure it expresses itself in your life too. That drive for approval and the voices of our culture very much drown out the voice of God around us. We see it in the Katies of the world who have missed out on love and approval from her parents, and she searches for love in all the wrong places. Though she knows the Bible and what the Bible has to say about sex outside of marriage, the voices of her past and the voices of society kind of absorb her into doing something that she thinks will provide her with what she's desperately searching after. Though she knows what God has to say, she kind of edits out the word of God and what it teaches and just says, well, as long as there's consent, as long as nobody gets hurt. And she just steps in and makes this rash decision that seems right at the time, a way to finally get love and acceptance, but will forever leave her hurt. Or we see it in the Mikes of the world, driven to succeed because they want to be accepted as well. It's the same drive as Katie's, but expresses itself in these long hours and this willingness to sacrifice marriage and children for the idol of success. The idol of success in our culture demands the ultimate sacrifice, career before marriage, personal hopes and dreams over friends. Just prove yourself, success yells, and then you will finally belong. You'll finally be somebody in our world. You'll be accepted. The drive for approval drives us to act in ways that will forever hurt us and our homes. So what do we do with this insidious hunger that we have? How is it that we break this vicious pattern that goes on in our lives and the lives of so many in our society? I'm going to mention two things before I finish. I think first is that each of us needs to be grounded in a robust faith and theology. You see, I've heard people say way too many times, we don't need theology. People just need to have an experience of God. And then they'll add something like, what I'm into is helping people to have an experience of God. I don't have any time for theology. That's kind of just not necessary. That idea is both ridiculous and dangerous. This story should show us that. Imagine actually that you visit a doctor. And, you say to the doctor, I have this pain in my stomach. And the doctor says, well, I didn't really pay all that much attention at medical school. We don't need that stuff. What I tended to focus on was kind of a bedside manner because people need to feel good about themselves. I want people to feel really comfortable when they're around me and have a really good experience. So why don't you lie down and I'll kind of cut you open and just see what I can see inside you. You'd be out of the surgery in a split second. It's the same thing that goes on here. It sounds good. Experiencing the presence of God is genuinely wonderful. But we need a deep faith in God and a robust theology. If we just stay with a shallow understanding of God, we'll kind of be led into this superficiality, this nonsense that can do great damage to our lives and the lives of others. See, Jephthah loved God. He had a passion to be used by God. Even shows up in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11. Did amazing things. But either he didn't know the Word of God or he edited out different parts of the Bible, and he ends up offering his daughter as a human sacrifice. See, I'm deeply concerned today about how loud the voices of others can drown out the voice of God in people's lives. I'm deeply concerned, increasingly so, of the little amount followers of Jesus spend reading their Bible, seeking to understand the Word of God. If you listen to the radio or to talk show hosts or people who call in and say they're followers of Jesus and then say something, you kind of get a bit of an idea of how foolish we're becoming. It's scary. And there's no excuse for us. Let me give you, 3 steps. If you want to kind of step into that, if you need some help in that, here's 3 ways you might want to step into just getting a robust theology for yourself. First is a good Bible reading plan. If you don't have one that I'd recommend that I'm using at the moment is from Holy Trinity Brompton, the founders of Alpha. You can Google it, Bible in a year, Holy Trinity Brompton, you'll find it. Details are actually in your bulletin this morning too. For me, it comes straight to my phone in the morning, so the first thing I see when I switch it on is this reading for the day, along with some really good devotional comments around it. If you're looking for a reading plan, I encourage you to look that way, but there's so many resources that are out there. A second thing you might want to look at is if you're exploring faith, I would encourage you to check out Alpha. It's another course beginning in 3 or 4 weeks' time. As I said before, we've run like 70 courses here. It's amazing. It's a really good first step to take. And you can find out more about that at the reception desk following the service. And then we have a new initiative starting soon too. It's beginning in the next week and a half. That if you're new to Christian faith or want to take some kind of first steps and have kind of a mentor or kind of coach helping you through that, we have a new course called The Journey that's about to start. It just gives you the basics of the Christian faith. We partner you up with somebody who can kind of walk alongside you in that, and then talk about a whole bunch of different helpful groups and ministries at your disposal. See, these are just some of the things we provide here, but it's your responsibility to ensure you're actually eating and devouring God's word, allowing that to renew the way you think and what we know from what God has said. Because you see, while Jephthah brought peace to a city, he experienced chaos at home. While he won in the city, he ultimately lost at home. It's one thing for us to pick up a fight out there. And I love the stories that I'm hearing of people engaging in needs in our society and wanting to be used by God to do something. But there's a fight in here that's needed as well. And one of the things that we all need to ensure is we have a robust faith and theology. But even more importantly is one other thing I want to share before we finish. And that's that you satisfy that insidious approval in the right place. So that drive for acceptance and approval is there in all of us. And actually, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. The desire to satisfy it isn't wrong. The issue is where you turn, what you turn to, in this desire to satisfy these cravings. Ultimately, the pattern can only be broken by finding an approval greater than any crowd or spouse or friend can provide. See, sadly, Jephthah seems to know nothing about grace. He grew up in a world where who you were born to and how you acted is all about how you would be approved and accepted, whether you would belong or not. Just all he experienced was ungrace. He thought he needed to earn something from God, needed to kind of perform even by God himself. He was mistaken. You see, God was already on his side. After all, God invites us just as we are, even with all of our issues, to come to him. So maybe you have scars from your past and they drive you to succeed at all costs. And you're driven because you think your acceptance and approval somehow depends on you and your performance to be accepted. The Christian story, what we call the gospel, teaches us how Jesus stepped in to our world. how Jesus knew rejection. That much like Jephthah, Jesus was accustomed to these accusation and slanderous comments about his own birth. He was rejected by his own town, rejected by the religious establishment, rejected by his own friends. And yet he voluntarily stepped in to break this insidious pattern and to actually bring peace to everyone around him, including you and me. And the Bible says that he traded places with us. He gave up his perfect standing and approval before a holy God, and he took on our standing, which wasn't all that great. And so we ultimately now stand before a holy God and are loved and accepted and approved because Jesus has already performed in our place. Jesus earned that for us, so we don't have to earn anything anymore. There's a book called The Whisper Test. I don't know if any of you have read it here, but in it, the author speaks about the experiences that she endured as a child. Mary Ann Bird was born with multiple birth defects. She was deaf in one ear, a cleft palate, a disfigured face, crooked nose, lopsided feet. You can imagine that she was mocked as a child. As a child, Mary Ann suffered not only the physical impairments, but also the emotional damage inflicted by the children around her. Mary Ann, why is your face so disfigured? She'd say, I cut it on a piece of glass, she would lie. One of the worst experiences at school, she writes in the book, was the day of the annual hearing test. The teacher would call each child to her desk, and the child would cover, first one ear, then the other, and they'd have this hearing test. And the teacher would whisper words like, the sky is blue, or you have new shoes. This was the whisper test. If the teacher's phrase could be heard and repeated, the child passed the test. Now, Mary Ann hated this test because she was deaf in one ear, and to avoid the humiliation and the failure of the test, she would kind of cheat. She would pretend to cup, the hand over her ear that she could hear in, but use that to kind of hear what the teacher was always saying. One year, Mary Ann was in the class of Miss Leonard, one of the most beloved teachers in the school. Each student, including Mary Ann, wanted to be noticed by her. Then came the day of the dreaded hearing test. And when her turn came, Mary Ann was called to the teacher's desk. And with her, hand cupped over her good ear, pretending that she had it covered, Miss Leonard leaned forward to whisper. She heard 7 words, Mary Ann said, that would change her life forever. Miss Leonard did not say, the sky is blue. She didn't whisper, you have new shoes. What she whispered was, I wish you were my little girl. Mary Ann said those words radically affected her life. She believed those words were placed there by God himself. Mary Ann went on to become a teacher herself, and she wrote this book called The Whisper Test. See, God whispers to you and to me, I am pleased you are my child. The Spirit whispers to us, there is nothing you can do to make me love you more. There is nothing you can do to make me love you less. Do you hear those words? When you receive the generous love of God, when you find the Spirit of God entering your life, that insidious drive for approval can be satisfied. And God begins to repair the wounds and brings a newfound freedom and joy and peace. I'd like to invite the ushers up to begin passing out our communion elements, the bread and the cup. If you're a follower of Jesus, I invite you to take one of these elements and just sit in quietness for a moment. And as you hold it in your hand, I'm just asking that you would try to listen to what the Spirit of God might be saying to you today about his love for you, about his affection for you. And if you need proof of that, you need to look no other than the elements you're holding in your hand. The bread and the cup reminding you that Jesus stepped in to die for you out of great love. And he swapped places with you so that you now stand where he once stood, completely approved by his Father. that there is nothing you can do that would cause God to love you more, and nothing you can do that will cause God to love you less. Just hold it in your hand. I'll come back in a moment.